Long before the first drop of rain fell as punishment, long before the earth split open and poured forth water from below, something far quieter was happening. It was not happening in the sky or in the ground. It was happening inside the hearts of human beings. Slowly, generation after generation, like a single crack spreading across a sheet of glass until the whole structure was ready to shatter. The world at that time was not a primitive world of ignorance. It was a world of memory. The descendants of Adam still remembered, at least in name, who their creator was. They knew the stories of their ancestors, the righteous men and women who had walked the earth with humility, who had bowed before God alone and asked nothing of stone or wood or sky. But memory, when it is not renewed, begins to fade. And when memory fades, something else moves in to take its place. It began with grief. There were among the early generations a group of righteous men, men whose lives had been marked by devotion, by guidance, by closeness to God. When they died, the people who loved them were overcome with sorrow. They wanted to remember them, to keep their faces and their virtues alive in the minds of the next generation. So they carved images of these men. They placed these images in gathering places, not to worship them, but simply to remember them, to look upon their faces and recall their goodness, and to be inspired toward the same righteousness. That was the first generation. They looked at the statues and remembered the men. They did not bow to stone. They bowed only to God, and the statues were simply a mirror held up to virtue. But the second generation did not carry the same memory. To them, these were not images of men they had personally loved and mourned. These were simply figures that had always been there, standing in places of honor, treated with a certain reverence by their parents. The children saw their elders pause before these images, speak of them with hushed respect, and the children absorbed the form of the reverence without understanding its meaning. By the third generation, the meaning was gone entirely, and only the form remained. The statues were no longer reminders of righteous men. They had become objects of devotion in themselves. People began to believe that these stone figures could intercede for them, that they held some power, that prayers offered before them would be heard and answered. The names of those righteous men, men whose only legacy should have been a life of sincere devotion to the one God, became the names of idols. Stone gods with human names, standing in temples, receiving the prayers and sacrifices that belong to no one but the Creator of the heavens and the earth. This is how corruption enters a people. It does not arrive as an army. It arrives as a small drift, an unnoticed shift, a tradition repeated without its original meaning until the meaning is entirely replaced by something else. And once that drift becomes normal, it becomes very difficult to reverse, because by then it is not seen as corruption at all. It is simply seen as the way things have always been. By the time many generations had passed, the land was filled with these idols. Each tribe, each family had its own object of worship. Carved figures representing those ancient righteous men, now transformed into gods who were believed to control rainfall, fertility, health, and fortune. The people built shrines around them, offered sacrifices to them, and structured their entire understanding of the universe around the idea that these lifeless objects held real power. Alongside this spiritual corruption came every other kind. Where there is no firm belief in a creator who sees, who judges, who holds every soul accountable, human behavior tends to drift toward whatever serves the appetites of the moment. The wealthy oppress the poor without fear of consequence, because what consequence could there be if the only powers that mattered were stone idols who demanded nothing but offerings? The strong took from the weak. Dishonesty in trade, cruelty in dealings, arrogance among the powerful, all of it spread because the restraint that comes from believing one is always being watched by a just God had been removed from the hearts of the people. It was into this world, a world that had once known the truth and had slowly buried it under layers of forgetfulness, tradition, and self-interest, that a man was born who would carry one of the heaviest responsibilities ever placed upon a human being. His name was Noah. He was not born into obscurity. His lineage connected him to the earliest generations of humanity, a chain of descent that linked him back toward Adam himself through righteous forebears who had once known the truth clearly. By the time Noah grew into manhood, that clarity had almost entirely disappeared from the world around him. But it had not disappeared from him, whether through inherited teaching, inner conviction, or direct revelation. Noah understood something that almost no one else around him understood anymore. That there is only one God, that this God alone deserves worship, and that everything else, every idol, every carved figure, every object of devotion that people had built their lives around, was nothing but empty stone, deaf and blind and powerless. This understanding alone would have been a heavy thing to carry quietly. But Noah was not given the option of quiet conviction. He was chosen to speak. The calling did not come as a single dramatic event witnessed by crowds. It came the way most callings from God come. Privately, internally, a certainty placed into the heart of one man, a charge that from this point forward, his life would no longer belong only to himself. He was to go to his people, his own community, his own neighbors, the people he had grown up among, and tell them the truth they had forgotten. He was to call them back from the idols to the one who made them. He was to warn them that a day of reckoning was coming, and that the path they were on led only to ruin. Imagine for a moment the weight of that first morning, waking with the knowledge that you carry a message the entire world around you does not want to hear, knowing that the people you will speak to are not strangers in a distant land, but your own relatives, your own tribe, people whose fathers and grandfathers built the very idols you must now tell them to abandon. Knowing that the comfortable, familiar world they live in, a world where everyone agrees on what is true, where tradition is sacred, where the idols have stood in their places for longer than anyone can remember, is about to be challenged by your voice and only your voice. This is the true beginning of Noah's call, not the flood, not the ark. Those would come later after centuries of something far less dramatic and far more difficult, the long, slow, grinding work of trying to wake up a sleeping world, one heart at a time for nearly 1,000 years. Noah began to speak. He did not begin with threats. He did not begin by condemning his people as fools or sinners. He began the way any person who genuinely loves those they are speaking to would begin, with an invitation. He reminded them of who their Creator truly was. He spoke of the sky above them, held without pillars. He spoke of the earth beneath them, spread out and made livable. He spoke of the water that fell from the clouds and gave life to crops, of the cycles of day and night, of the design and order that surrounded them on every side. And he asked them, gently at first, to consider, who made all of this? Was it the stone figures standing silent in their shrines? Could those figures hear a single word spoken to them? Could they answer a single prayer? Could they create even the smallest insect, let alone the heavens and the earth? He told them that the path they were on, worshipping these powerless idols, living as though there would never be a reckoning for their cruelty and injustice, led only toward destruction. And he told them that there was still time, that the door of return was open, that if they turned back now sincerely with humble hearts, their Lord would forgive what had passed, would send down blessings upon them, would multiply their wealth and their children and grant them strength, but only if they turned back while they still could. This was the heart of his message, repeated again and again across the centuries that followed. Turn back while you still can. Ask forgiveness while the door is still open. The mercy of God is vast, but it is not infinite in the sense of having no end point. There comes a moment when a people's choices harden into a final shape, and after that point, the consequences of those choices can no longer be avoided. At first, his words were met with curiosity, perhaps even mild interest from a few, but curiosity quickly gave way to something else, as it almost always does when a message threatens not just belief, but identity, status, tradition, and the comfortable arrangements of power. The leaders of his people, the wealthy, the influential, the elders whose authority rested partly on the religious traditions Noah was now calling into question, were the first and fiercest to turn against him. It is always those with the most invested in the existing order who feel the most threatened by a call to change, because change does not just ask them to think differently. It asks them to give up the position, the respect, the wealth, and the certainty they have built their entire lives around. They began to mock him. They pointed out that he was only a man just like them, eating the same food, walking the same streets, sleeping under the same roofs. If God truly wished to send a message, they argued, surely he would send something more impressive than an ordinary man from among themselves. Surely a true messenger would arrive with visible glory, with angels descending before the eyes of all, with undeniable proof that could not be questioned. They asked him mockingly why, if his God was truly capable of sending down whatever punishment he warned of, that punishment did not simply arrive immediately. If what he said was true, let it come now. Let them see it. Until then, they would continue exactly as they had been living, because nothing he said had given them any reason, in their eyes, to believe otherwise. And there was something else, something that cut even deeper. They looked at who actually believed Noah's message, and they used it against him. The people who first responded to his call were not the powerful, the wealthy, the socially prominent. They were, for the most part, ordinary people. The poor, the laborers, those without status or influence in the tribal hierarchy. The elite looked at this and said, in effect, why would we follow a path that only the lowest among us have chosen to follow? If this message were truly from God, surely it would have been recognized first by those of intelligence and standing, by us. This is one of the oldest and most persistent obstacles to truth in human history. The assumption that worth is measured by social position, that the value of an idea can be judged by the status of those who accept it rather than by the idea itself. Noah's response to this accusation was simple and remains to this day one of the most piercing replies ever given to such arrogance. He did not argue that his followers were secretly important people in disguise. He did not try to elevate their status to make them more acceptable to the elite. Instead, he asked his accusers a different question entirely. What business is it of his or of theirs to look into the hearts of these believers and judge their worth? Their reckoning, their inner reality, was a matter between them and their Creator alone. Noah's responsibility was only to deliver the message and warn the people, not to filter who was permitted to accept it based on how impressive they appeared to society. He told his people plainly that he was not asking them for any wealth in return for his message. He sought no payment, no reward, no advantage for himself. His reward, he said, rested only with God. He was not a man chasing influence or building a following for personal gain. He was simply delivering what he had been entrusted to deliver, and whether they accepted it or rejected it changed nothing about his own sincerity. But sincerity, however clear, is not always enough to move a heart that has decided in advance not to be moved. Years passed. Then decades, then generations. Noah continued his call. By day, calling people openly in public. By night, going to them privately, speaking to them quietly when the crowds were not watching. Trying every approach a human being could try to reach another human being's heart. He reminded them, he warned them, he pleaded with them. He gave them examples from the world around them. The growth of plants from the earth, the stages of human creation, the orderly movement of the sun and the moon, pointing again and again to the same conclusion. There is a Creator behind all of this, a Creator who deserves your worship and who will one day call you to account for how you lived. And the response, generation after generation, remained largely the same: mockery, dismissal. In some traditions, it is described that whenever Noah passed certain groups of people, they would taunt him, and parents would tell their children, "If you see that man, do not listen to a single word he says. He is mad. He wants to take away the gods of your fathers." This is perhaps one of the most sorrowful aspects of the entire account. Not the rejection of one generation, but the deliberate transmission of that rejection to the next. Children who had never personally heard Noah's message, who had never weighed his words for themselves, were raised from infancy to dismiss him before he ever spoke to them. The rejection became inherited, passed down like a family possession, hardening with each generation until it became simply part of who these people understood themselves to be. We are the people who do not listen to Noah. Imagine standing in front of a wall like that. Not a wall built once, but a wall rebuilt every generation, each new layer added by parents who had themselves inherited the wall from their own parents. Imagine speaking, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, to a wall that grows thicker the longer you speak to it. And yet Noah did not stop. This is perhaps the truest miracle within this entire account. Not the flood, not the ark, but the simple fact of nearly 1,000 years of unbroken patience and persistence in the face of almost total rejection. The Quran describes his time among his people in terms that mean 1,000 years, less 50, 950 years of calling, pleading, warning, and inviting, with what the text describes as only a small number of believers ever responding. Think about what that means for a single human being. 950 years of waking each day to the same task, the same resistance, the same mockery, watching generation after generation be born, grow old, and die without accepting the one message that could have saved them, and continuing anyway, not because success seemed likely, not because the numbers were encouraging, but because the responsibility itself did not depend on the outcome. Noah's task was to deliver the message faithfully, with sincerity, for as long as he was required to do so. And the results of that delivery were never his to control. There is something in this for every person who has ever tried to do something right in a world that does not want to hear it. Every person who has spoken truth to family members who refuse to listen, who has tried to live with integrity in an environment that mocks integrity, who has felt that their efforts are accomplishing nothing because nothing visible seems to change. Noah's centuries of patience stand as a permanent answer to the despair that whispers, "What's the point if nothing changes?" The point was never solely the changing. The point was the faithfulness of the effort itself. But even patience as vast as Noah's has its limits, not in terms of his willingness to continue, but in terms of what God ultimately permits to continue. The personal dimension of Noah's struggle was not limited to strangers and tribal elders. It reached into his own household. And this, too, is part of what makes this account so deeply human, rather than simply a tale of distant ancient history. Noah's wife did not believe. Despite living under the same roof as a prophet of God, despite witnessing firsthand the sincerity of his calling, despite decades, perhaps centuries, of proximity to the truth, she remained among those who rejected it. And one of Noah's own sons also did not believe. A young man who, despite being raised by a father carrying the most important message a human being could carry, chose instead to stand with the rejectors. This detail matters enormously because it dismantles one of the most common assumptions people make about faith and family. The assumption that righteousness is something that can simply be transferred, like an inheritance, from parent to child, or that proximity to a righteous person guarantees a person's own righteousness. It cannot, and it does not. Faith is not blood, it is not surname, it is not household address. Each soul stands before its Creator entirely on the basis of its own choices. And even the household of a prophet was not exempt from this reality. Noah loved his family, of course. He was still a father, still a husband, still a man with the same natural attachments any human being has toward those closest to them. But love for one's family and submission to the truth are not always the same path, and when they diverge, a person of true faith must ultimately walk the path of truth, even when it means walking it without those they love most standing beside them. This tension between natural love and divine command, between the heart's attachments and the soul's obligations, would become the most painful thread running through the final chapters of Noah's story. After centuries of calling, after the message had been delivered as completely and as patiently as it was humanly possible to deliver it, something shifted. It was not a shift in Noah's effort. His effort had never wavered. It was a shift in what God permitted to happen next. Noah prayed. After everything, after the mockery, the rejection, the inherited hostility passed from parent to child for generations, after watching his own message be dismissed as the ravings of a madman by people who would not even consider it, Noah turned to his Lord and said, in essence, "My people have rejected me, and I have been overcome. Grant me victory." He did not ask for this lightly, and he did not ask for it quickly. This was not the prayer of an impatient man giving up after a difficult week. This was the prayer of a man who had given everything he had to give, for longer than any human mind can truly comprehend, and who now recognized that the time for invitation had reached its end. Not because he had failed, but because the door that had been open for nearly 1,000 years was now, by the choice of the people themselves, closing. And the response came, not as further argument, not as another round of evidence or persuasion, but as a command of an entirely different nature. Build a ship. Imagine receiving that instruction. Not prepare your people or warn them more loudly, but build a ship. A vessel of significant size, constructed under God's guidance, with God's own oversight described as watching over the work. And do this where? Among a people who lived in many accounts far from any sea or major body of water that their daily lives revolved around. Build an enormous vessel, in full view of a population that has spent centuries calling you mad, for a flood that has not yet shown the slightest sign of arriving, under a clear sky with no rain, in a land that gave no outward indication that anything unusual was coming. If the previous 950 years had given Noah's opponents reason to mock him, this gave them an entirely new category of mockery altogether. Picture the scene. Noah, now an old man by any ordinary human measure, gathering wood, working alongside whatever small number of believers remained loyal to him, constructing this massive structure piece by piece. And all around, the people of the town walking past, day after day, watching this project rise out of the ground with no sea in sight, no clouds gathering, no sign of rain. They would have stopped to watch. They would have laughed. They would have called out to him, asking what madness this was now, building a boat on dry land, as though he expected the desert itself to become an ocean. Some accounts describe them mocking him so persistently that it became one of the most visible symbols of his supposed insanity in the eyes of the town, the prophet who builds ships in the sand. And Noah's response to this mockery is one of the most quietly powerful moments in the entire account. He did not argue with them. He did not try to explain or defend the project. He simply told them, "If you mock us now, a time will come when we will mock you in turn, when you will come to know exactly who it was that the punishment fell upon, and who it was that was rightly guided." He kept building. This is perhaps the truest test contained within the entire story. Not the flood itself, but this period before it. The period where obedience required action that made no sense by any visible standard. Where faith required building something that the entire surrounding world insisted was pointless. Where the only evidence that any of this mattered was the inner certainty of a man and a small handful of others who trusted him. How many people throughout history have faced a smaller version of exactly this moment, being asked, by conscience, by faith, by what they know to be right, to do something that the world around them finds laughable, impractical, embarrassing, a waste of time and resources, when there is no visible sign yet that any of it will matter? The hardest obedience is rarely the obedience that comes with clear and immediate justification. The hardest obedience is the one that requires action while everything around you insists the action is foolish. The ship built under a clear sky. The ship was completed, and then the signs began. The first sign came from below, not above. Water began to gush forth, not from rain clouds gathering overhead, but from the ground itself, springing up from the earth with tremendous force, as though the world's deep reservoirs had suddenly been unsealed. In some accounts, this is described as beginning from an oven, a domestic, ordinary household object, the very symbol of daily human life and sustenance, becoming instead the first point from which the flood erupted. There is something deeply symbolic in this detail. The catastrophe did not begin in some distant, exotic location, separate from ordinary human life. It began in the home itself, in the most familiar and mundane object imaginable, a sign that no corner of the world these people had built for themselves, no matter how comfortable or familiar, would remain untouched. And then the sky answered. The heavens opened, and rain began to fall. Not as an ordinary storm, not as the rains the people had known their entire lives, but as a continuous, unrelenting torrent, water descending from above to meet the water rising from below, the two sources converging exactly as Noah had been told they would. It was time. Noah called out to those around him, to the believers, to his family, to board the ship. And here the account reaches its most heartbreaking moment. Among those called was Noah's son, the one who had not believed. As the waters began to rise and the chaos of the flood took hold around them, Noah, as a father, called out to his son, urging him to come aboard with them, to not remain with those who rejected the truth. The son's response reveals, in a single moment, the entire tragedy of misplaced confidence. He told his father that he would climb to a mountain, that the mountain would protect him from the water. He believed that his own judgment, his own strength, his own chosen refuge, a tall piece of high ground, something solid and visible and seemingly secure, would be enough to save him, even as the one true means of safety. The ark his own father had spent years building under divine command sat right in front of him. Noah called out again, telling him there was no refuge that day except in the mercy of God, and that nothing, no mountain, no height, no human strategy, could shelter anyone from what was coming except through that mercy. But a wave came between them, and the son was among those who were drowned. This single scene contains perhaps the entire moral weight of the whole account, distilled into one father's cry across rising water to a son who chooses the wrong refuge. It is not a scene about wickedness in the dramatic sense. The son is not described as a violent man, a tyrant, an oppressor. He is described simply as someone who trusted in his own judgment about what would keep him safe, right up until the moment that judgment proved fatally wrong, and by then it was too late to change course. How many people, in every generation since, have done exactly this? Trusted in their own version of the mountain, their wealth, their health, their connections, their own cleverness, their belief that they personally are exempt from the consequences that apply to everyone else, right up until the waters rise high enough to reveal that the mountain was never the safety it appeared to be. Noah, watching this happen to his own son, turned to his Lord. He could not simply let it pass without a word. This was his son, his own child, and the natural love of a father for his child does not vanish simply because that child has made the wrong choice. Noah called out, reminding his Lord that this was his son, and that the promise of God is true, and asking, not as a demand, but as the cry of a grieving father, for his son to be among those saved. And the response he received was not a rebuke delivered harshly, but it was firm, and it was clarifying in a way that reshaped Noah's entire understanding of what was happening. He was told that his son was not, in the way that mattered now, truly of his family. Not in the sense of shared belief, shared righteousness, the bond that actually matters in the eyes of God. His conduct had placed him outside of that bond. And Noah was reminded, gently but unmistakably, not to ask about something he had no true knowledge of, lest he find himself among those who act in ignorance. Noah's response to this is itself a model of how a person of faith responds to correction, even correction that touches the deepest of human attachments. He did not argue. He did not protest. He immediately turned back to his Lord, seeking refuge from ever asking again about something he had no knowledge of, asking for forgiveness and mercy. In this single exchange is contained one of the most profound lessons of the entire account, that even the love between a father and his child, one of the strongest bonds that exists among human beings, must ultimately bow before the reality of each soul's individual standing before its creator. Family, blood, history, shared years under the same roof, none of these are currency that can purchase safety on a day when only sincere faith and righteous conduct matter, and even a prophet in the rawest moment of personal grief had to learn and accept this truth completely. The flood continued. The waters rose until they covered everything. Every hill, every refuge the people of the land had imagined would protect them, all of it submerged beneath a flood so total that nothing visible remained except the ship itself, carried upon the surface of an endless sea, and the small number of souls within it. Noah, the believers who had stood with him, and pairs of living creatures brought aboard so that life itself, in all its forms, would not be erased from the world. And then, as the waters had risen, so too did the command come for them to recede. The earth was told to swallow its water, the sky was told to withhold its rain, and slowly, the world began to reappear. Hills emerged first, then plains, then the shape of the land itself, washed clean, silent, and utterly transformed. The ship came to rest upon a mountain that came to be known, in the memory of those who told this story afterward, as the place where it settled, the resting point after the long voyage upon the floodwaters. And it was said, both as a closing of one chapter and the opening of another, that those who had been destroyed were a wrongdoing people, and that the ones who remained were left to inherit a world made new. What does it mean to inherit a world made new? It does not simply mean a clean landscape, free of the bodies and ruins of a destroyed civilization, though it meant that too. It meant something far heavier, an entirely fresh opportunity granted to a small number of people to build human civilization again, this time, hopefully, with the lesson of what had just happened carried forward in memory, passed down not as a forgotten myth but as a living warning. And this, ultimately, is the deepest meaning behind the phrase, awakening the soul before the flood. The flood itself was not the actual disaster. The flood was simply the final, physical, undeniable manifestation of a disaster that had already occurred long before. A disaster of the soul, a slow drowning that had taken place over centuries as one generation after another allowed their connection to truth to be replaced by stone idols, inherited mockery, and the comfortable assumption that nothing would ever change, that warnings could be ignored indefinitely, that the door of return would remain open forever, regardless of how long it was refused. The real flood was spiritual, and it had been rising for 950 years before a single drop of water fell from the sky. This is why the story of Noah is told and retold. Not as a piece of ancient history disconnected from the present, but as a mirror. Every generation faces its own version of the choice Noah's people faced. The choice between waking up to a truth that requires change, discomfort, and the abandonment of comfortable inherited assumptions, or remaining asleep, mocking the very warnings that might have saved them, trusting in mountains of one's own making that offer no real refuge at all. The story asks each person who hears it the same questions it asked then. What idols, not necessarily carved from stone, but built from habit, from comfort, from inherited assumption, from the unquestioned authority of the way things have always been, have quietly taken the place of what truly deserves devotion? What warnings, however gently or persistently delivered, have been dismissed simply because they were inconvenient, or because they came from someone without status, or because the changes they called for seemed too difficult, too disruptive, too far removed from how things have always been done? And what mountain, what false refuge, what source of confidence that has nothing to do with sincerity, righteousness, or truth is being quietly trusted to provide safety, right up until the moment the water rises high enough to reveal that it never could? Noah's call was, in the end, an invitation extended across nearly 1,000 years to wake up before it was too late. Not from physical sleep, but from the deeper sleep of a soul that has stopped questioning, stopped examining itself, stopped considering that the comfortable path it has always walked might be leading somewhere it does not want to go. The flood came only after that invitation had been extended, in every possible way, for as long as it was possible to extend it. It came only after centuries of patience, after every form of evidence and reminder had been offered, after the door of return had been left open far longer than most would consider reasonable. And when it finally came, it came not as a punishment for a single act, but as the final, physical seal upon a choice that had already been made, slowly, quietly, and repeatedly, by generation after generation. The choice to remain asleep. The ship that carried Noah and those with him was not simply a vessel that survived a flood. It was the physical form of an answer, the answer of those who had chosen, finally, after everything, to wake up. And the new world they inherited afterward was not simply land emerging from water. It was a second chance, offered to a small number of souls who had proven, through everything that came before, that they understood what it meant to truly hear a call, and to answer it, while there was still time to do so. That is the call that echoes through this entire account, and it is the same call that echoes still. Wake up while the sky is still clear. Wake up while the door is still open. Wake up before the flood, because the flood, in whatever form it ultimately takes, only ever comes after the chance to wake up has already been given, again and again, for far longer than anyone deserved.